Vareth's own had fought in wars across 200 years, and he had never once felt afraid. This was not courage, and it was not bravery in the way most species understood such things. It was simply biology, a gift his people had given themselves. Long ago, when they decided that fear was a weakness that needed to be removed, the HFY were born with fear like any other creature. But when they reached the age of maturity, their elders would place them in the surgical chambers and cut it away, slicing through neural pathways and installing implants that would suppress any emotion that might interfere with logical thought. Vareth remembered the procedure even now, remembered lying on the cold table as the machines hummed above him, remembered the strange sensation of something being taken from his mind that he would never get back. He had been 16 years old, and he had been afraid for the last time, or so he had believed now. He stood on the observation deck of the Concordance and watched the stars blur past as the massive warship hurtled toward what might be the most important battle of the century. And he felt nothing but calm assessment of the tactical situation ahead. The Hollow were coming, and the Hollow had to be stopped. They were not a species in the traditional sense, but rather a hive mind, a vast interconnected consciousness that spread from world to world like a plague, consuming everything in its path and adding the neural matter of its victims to its own ever-growing intelligence. They had destroyed 17 civilizations in the past 1,000 years, and they had never been defeated, never been pushed back, never shown any sign that they could even understand the concept of mercy or negotiation. Galactic Coalition had thrown fleet after fleet against them, and fleet after fleet had fallen. Vareth had led 3 of those failed campaigns himself, and each time he had watched his soldiers die by the thousands without feeling anything more than mild disappointment at the tactical outcome. That was the HFY way, and it had served him well for millennia, but now the Coalition had grown desperate. And desperation led to strange decisions. Commander Shaw. A voice called from behind him, and Vareth turned to see Admiral Kethros approaching with a datapad in her weathered hands. The human contingent has arrived, and they are requesting permission to board. Vareth had read the reports on them. Of course, every officer in the Coalition had received the briefing materials when humanity had first made contact 80 years ago. They were a young species, barely out of their own solar system, still fighting among themselves over resources and ideology. Even as they reached for the stars, they were emotional and unpredictable and prone to making decisions based on feelings rather than logic. They were everything the HFY had trained themselves not to be. Grant them permission, Vareth said, and his voice carried no hint of the skepticism he felt. We need every soldier we can get for this assault. The Admiral nodded and walked away, and Vareth turned back to the window to watch the first human shuttle approach. It was an ugly thing. All sharp angles and exposed weapons systems. Built for war rather than elegance, the HFY designed their ships to be efficient and beautiful because they believed that form should follow function and function should be perfect. The humans apparently believed that a ship should look like it wanted to kill you. Perhaps that should have been his first warning. The shuttle docked with a heavy clang that echoed through the hull, and Vareth made his way down to the hangar bay to greet his new soldiers. He had been assigned to lead a mixed unit for this mission. 50 of his own HFY veterans and 30 human Marines who would fight alongside them in the tunnels beneath the hollow Nexus world. Was an experiment, and Vareth did not particularly care for experiments. In the middle of a war, the hangar doors opened, and the humans marched out in 2 neat columns, and Vareth observed them with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying a new specimen. They were shorter than HFY on average, their bodies thick with muscle rather than the lean efficiency his people preferred. Their faces were open and expressive in ways that made Vareth uncomfortable. He could see fear and excitement and anticipation playing across their features like storms across a planetary surface. How did they function with so much noise in their heads? A woman stepped forward from the group, and Vareth recognized the insignia of a commander on her shoulder. She was perhaps 40 years old by human standards. Her dark hair cut short and practical. Her eyes a shade of brown that reminded Vareth of the forests on his homeworld. "Commander Chun," she said, and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "3rd Marine Battalion, Earth Defense Force." Vareth took her hand and shook it once, because he had learned that this was expected. "Commander Sol," he replied, "I have reviewed your service record, and I am satisfied that your soldiers meet the minimum requirements for this mission." Chun smiled at that, and there was something in the expression that Vareth could not quite read, something that sat behind her eyes like a predator waiting in tall grass. "We meet the requirements," she said, and her voice was light but her gaze was not. "I promise you that." The humans settled into their assigned quarters over the next several hours, and Vareth used that time to observe them through the ship's internal sensors. They did not behave like soldiers preparing for a dangerous mission. They laughed and joked with each other. They played games of chance with small tokens. They argued about trivial matters like the quality of the food or the temperature of the air. One of them was even singing, his deep voice carrying through the corridors in a melody that made no logical sense to Kethvari ears. Vareth watched them and wondered if the coalition had made a terrible mistake. The night before the assault, he found Commander Chun standing alone on the observation deck, staring out at the planet below. It was a dead world now, its surface transformed into a maze of organic tunnels and structures by the hollow, its atmosphere thick with spores that would kill any unprotected organism within minutes. "Tomorrow we go down there," Chun said without turning around. "Tomorrow we fight." "Yes," Vareth agreed and moved to stand beside her. "Our objective is the central hive node located approximately 3 kilometers beneath the surface, and we will need to fight through significant resistance to reach it. I know the mission parameters." "Then you know our survival probability is less than 20%. Chun turned to look at him then, and that strange expression was back in her eyes. That thing he could not name or understand. "My people have a saying, Commander," she said softly. "There are no atheists in foxholes." Vareth processed this statement and found it meaningless. "I do not understand." Chun smiled again and placed her hand briefly on his arm in a gesture that seemed almost like comfort. "You will," she said. "You will understand soon enough." She walked away and left him alone with the stars and the dead world below, and Vareth felt something stir in the depths of his suppressed mind, something that his implants quickly identified and neutralized. Before it could take root, it had almost felt like unease, but that was impossible. Kethvari did not feel unease, and they certainly did not feel afraid. Vareth was sure of that. As sure as he had ever been of anything, he would learn very soon how wrong he was. The drop pods fell through the toxic atmosphere like metal rain, and inside each one soldiers braced themselves for impact. Vareth counted the seconds in his head with perfect precision. 37 until they hit the surface, 42 until the doors would blow open, 45 until the first shots would be fired. This was combat as he understood it. A series of calculations and probabilities that could be mapped and predicted and controlled. The pod slammed into the ground with enough force to rattle his teeth, and the doors exploded outward, and Vareth was moving before the smoke had cleared. His plasma rifle came up, and he put 3 shots into the hollow drone that was rushing toward him. Each shot placed exactly where it needed to be to disable the creature's neural cluster. The drone fell, and Vareth stepped over it and kept moving around. His Kethvari soldiers were doing the same, emerging from their pods in perfect formation, their weapons singing the high-pitched song of plasma discharge as they cleared the landing zone with mechanical efficiency. No wasted movement, and no wasted ammunition, and no wasted emotion. This was how the Kethvari fought, and this was why they had been the coalition's premier soldiers for 3,000 Years then, the humans arrived. Their pods hit the ground. Harder than the HFY. One's because human engineering was less refined. And when their doors blew open, the sounds that emerged were unlike anything Vareth had ever heard on a battlefield. They were screaming, not screaming in pain or fear, but screaming in something that sounded almost like joy. Their voices raised in wordless battle cries as they poured out of their pods with weapons blazing. Commander Chun was among the first out, and she was shouting orders that Vareth could barely hear over the chaos. Her rifle spitting fire as she advanced into the enemy with no apparent concern for her own safety. "Push forward," she roared. "Give them nothing and take everything." A hollow warrior twice her size lunged at her from the left, and Chen did not retreat or calculate or assess. She simply pivoted and slammed the butt of a rifle into its face with enough force to crack its exoskeleton. Then, she shot it 3 times while it was falling and stepped on its twitching body as she continued forward. Watched this happen and felt his implants working overtime to suppress something that wanted to rise in his chest. The humans were not fighting correctly. They were too aggressive and too loud and too willing to take risks that no sensible soldier would ever take. A young Marine to Vareth's left took a hit to the arm, the hollow's claw ripping through his armor and tearing a gash from elbow to wrist that immediately began pouring blood. Any HFY soldier would have fallen back to receive medical attention, because continuing to fight with such an injury would reduce combat effectiveness by at least 40%. The Marine looked at his ruined arm and actually laughed, as if he had just been told an amusing joke at a social gathering. "Just a scratch." He shouted to no one in particular and raised his rifle one-handed and kept firing. Blood dripping down his fingers and onto the ground. Vareth moved to his side and grabbed his shoulder. "You are injured," he said. "Fall back to the medics." The Marine looked at him with wild eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. "Fall back?" He repeated as if the words made no sense. "We just got here, Commander. And I owe these bugs for what they did to my sister's colony." He pulled away from Vareth's grip and charged forward into a cluster of drones. Still laughing, still bleeding, still fighting. Commander Chun appeared at Vareth's side, and he turned to her with what might have been confusion if his implants had allowed such a thing. "Your soldier is badly wounded," he said. "Why does he not withdraw?" Chun smiled that strange smile again. "Adrenaline," she said, as if that explained everything. "I do not understand. It is a chemical that our bodies produce when we are afraid or angry." Chun explained while simultaneously putting a plasma bolt through a drone's eye. "It makes us stronger and faster, and it blocks out pain. Your bodies produce a combat stimulant when you are afraid?" "Yes, that is biologically inefficient," Vareth said. "Fear should make an organism flee from danger, not run toward it." Chun shook her head, and something dark crossed her features. "Fear makes most species flee," she agreed. "But humans are different, and we learned a long time ago that the only way out of fear is through it." She paused and looked at him with those predator eyes. "When we are afraid, Commander, we get angry, and when we get angry, we fight harder." Vareth processed this information and filed it away for later analysis, and then returned his attention to the battle. The landing zone was secure now, and the combined force began moving toward the tunnel entrance that would take them down into the heart of the hollow. The tunnels were worse than the surface. They were organic, grown rather than built, and their walls pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence that cast everything in shades of green and purple. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was slippery with some kind of mucus that made every step treacherous. Vareth as soldiers moved through this environment with careful precision, their formation tight, their weapons ready. Their minds clear and focused. The humans moved differently. They spread out and took cover behind organic growths and communicated with hand signals and quiet words. Their eyes constantly moving. Their bodies never still. They looked like predators hunting prey, rather. Then soldiers following a tactical plan too. Kilometers into the tunnels they found the first sign of the previous assault force bodies everywhere. Dozens of them, all HFY, all torn apart with a violence that spoke of rage rather than necessitative. Looked at his fallen comrades and felt nothing because there was nothing to feel. They had died in service to the coalition and their sacrifice would be noted in the records, and that was all that needed to be said. The humans reacted differently. They stopped and stared at the carnage, and their faces twisted with expressions that Vareth could not fully read. One of them, a young woman with red hair, actually knelt beside a fallen HFY and closed his empty eyes with gentle fingers. "They were brave," she said quietly. "They deserve better than this, Commander." Chun moved through her soldiers, and her voice was low and cold when she spoke. "The Hollow did this to a coalition research station on Tau Ceti," she said. "They killed everyone, including the children, and they took their time doing it." She turned to look at Vareth, and her eyes were no longer the eyes of a professional soldier. They were the eyes of something older and darker and far more dangerous. "My brother was stationed on that colony," she said, "and I found what was left of him." The motion sensors on every soldier's armor suddenly began screaming warnings, and Vareth looked at the readouts and felt his implants surge with activity contacts everywhere. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, converging on their position from every direction. They were surrounded. There was no way out and no reinforcements coming, and the probability of survival had just dropped to nearly zero. Vareth looked at his soldiers and prepared to give the order to fall back and regroup. Then he looked at the humans. They were not preparing to fall back. They were checking their weapons and tightening their armor and looking at each other with expressions that made no tactical sense at all. They were smiling. Every single one of them was smiling, as if they had just received wonderful news instead of a death sentence. "Commander Chen," Vareth said, "we need to retreat and find a more defensible position." Chun turned to him, and her smile was the widest of all. "Retreat?" she said. "Why would we do that when the enemy has been kind enough to come to us?" The first wave of hollow burst from the walls, and the humans began to scream again, and Vareth realized with sudden clarity that he had never truly understood what humanity was capable of. He was about to learn. The hollow came like a wave of nightmares given flesh. Thousands of them pouring from the walls and ceiling and floor. Their bodies twisted into shapes designed for nothing but killing. Vareth calculated their odds of survival at less than 3% and began planning for an orderly death. The HFY would sell their lives as efficiently as possible and perhaps buy enough time for a few soldiers to escape and report back to the fleet. It was the logical thing to do. It was the only thing to do, but the humans had not read the same tactical manual. Commander Chun raised a rifle and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, and 3 hollow dropped dead. And then she did something that no HFY would ever consider doing. In such a situation, she charged. "Marines!" she roared, and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "We hold this line, and we do not give them 1 single inch of ground." "Ora!" the humans screamed back in unison, and then they were all charging. All 30 of them rushing forward into a wall of claws and teeth, and death with nothing but their weapons. And their Furivareth watched a human sergeant slam into a hollow drone with his shoulder and knock it backward, and then stomp on its head until it stopped moving. He watched a young Marine take a claw through her leg and respond by grabbing the creature's arm and using it as leverage to put her knife through its eye. He watched Humans fight back to back, covering each other, protecting each other, dying for each other without hesitation or calculation. They were not fighting like soldiers. They were fighting like animals now. That was wrong, because animals fought to survive, and these humans were fighting for something else entirely. Something that burned in their eyes and drove them forward, even when every logical part of their brain must have been screaming at them to run. One of the Marines, a massive man with dark skin and a shaved head, had his rifle torn from his hands by a hollow warrior. Instead of retreating to find another weapon, he grabbed the creature by its throat and began to squeeze, his muscles bulging beneath his armor, his teeth bared in a snarl that looked more monster than man. "This is for my grandmother," he screamed as he crushed the hollow's windpipe with his bare hands. "She survived the camps on Mars, and she would be ashamed of me if I ran from you." The creature died, and the Marine picked up its fallen claw and used it as a weapon. Hacking through the swarm with a tool made from the body of his enemy Earth, felt something stirring deep inside his mind. Something that his implants were struggling to contain it. It was not fear exactly, not yet, but it was something close. Something that whispered to him that he was witnessing things that should not be possible. The HFY were the finest soldiers in the galaxy, and they had been bred and trained and modified to be perfect weapons, but these humans were something different. They were chaos, given form, and rage given purpose, and fear transformed into something that looked almost like joy. Hollow Beast crashed through the line and headed straight for Vareth, its massive jaws opening wide enough to swallow him whole before he could raise his weapon. Human threw herself in front of him and took the bite that was meant for his throat. The creature's teeth sank into her shoulder, and she screamed. But even as she screamed, she was pulling the pin on a grenade and shoving it into the beast's mouth. "Get down," she managed to say, and Vareth dove to the ground as the grenade exploded and took the hollow's head apart in a shower of gore. Human collapsed beside him, her shoulder ruined, her blood pooling on the organic floor. But she was still alive, and she was looking at him with eyes that held no regret. "You okay, Commander?" she asked, as if she had not just sacrificed her body to save his life. "Why did you do that?" Vareth demanded. "You did not know me, and saving my life was not tactically necessary." The human smiled through her pain. "You are one of us now," she said simply, "and we do not leave our people behind." Another Marine appeared and dragged the wounded woman to cover, and Vareth stood and looked around at the battle still raging. Around him, the humans were winning. They should not have been winning, because the numbers were against them and the enemy was stronger and faster and more numerous, but they were winning anyway because they simply refused to accept any other outcome. A sergeant had lost both of his legs to a hollow blade and was propped against the wall of the tunnel, his rifle still firing, his voice still roaring defiance at the creatures trying to reach him. "Come on, men," he was shouting. "I have not killed enough of you yet, and I'm not leaving until I hit triple digits." Vareth watched him die, watched the hollow finally overwhelm him, watched him pull a grenade from his belt in his final moments and take a dozen of them with him into death. The sergeant was smiling as the explosion consumed him with implants screamed warnings at him. Detecting emotional patterns that should not have existed in a properly modified HFY mind, he ignored them because he was beginning to understand something important, something that changed everything he thought he knew about warfare and courage and fear. The humans were not brave in spite of their fear. They were brave because of it. Commander Chan appeared beside him again, her face covered in blood that might have been hers or might have been the enemy's, her eyes blazing with that terrible inner fire. "The path is open," she said, and pointed toward a tunnel that had been cleared by the human assault. "That leads to the hive node." Vareth looked at the tunnel and then looked at what remained of his forces. Half his HFY were dead, and more than 2/3 of the humans had fallen. The survivors were exhausted and wounded and running low on ammunition. By any reasonable measure, they should have retreated to the surface and called for extraction, but Chun was not looking at her casualties. She was looking at the tunnel, and she was still smiling that terrible smile. "We can finish this," she said. And it was not a question. "We can end this right now." Vareth felt his implants fighting a losing battle against whatever was rising in his chest. "Your soldiers have given everything," he said. "They have the right to withdraw." Chun shook her head. "They would never forgive me if I took this moment away from them," she said. "And honestly, Commander, neither would I." She turned to face the surviving humans, and her voice rang out through the tunnel. "Marines, the node is just ahead, and these bugs think they can stop us." A ragged cheer rose from the bloody survivors. "Are we going to let them?" "No." The humans roared back. "Then let us go show them what happens when you make humanity angry." The humans began moving toward the tunnel, limping and crawling and dragging themselves forward with pure willpower, and Vareth followed them because he no longer had any idea what else to do. The hive mind was waiting, and Chun was still smiling, and Vareth felt the first crack appear in the walls of his carefully constructed mental fortress. Something was coming, something that would change him forever, and for the first time in almost 200 years. Vareth Solon was not sure he wanted to know what it was. The chamber at the heart of the hollow nexus was vast beyond anything Vareth had ever seen. A cathedral of flesh and bone that stretched so high the ceiling disappeared into darkness. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins that cast everything in sickly shades of green, and the air was thick with a smell that reminded Vareth of rotting fruit and ancient death. In the center of the chamber sat the hive node itself. It was not a machine or a building or anything that could be easily described. It was a mass of neural tissue the size of a small mountain. Countless brains from countless species, all fused together into a single terrible consciousness. This was the mind that controlled the hollow, the intelligence that had consumed civilizations and destroyed worlds and brought the galaxy to the edge of extinction, and it was aware of them. The mass shifted and twisted, and 1,000 mouths opened across its surface and spoke in 1,000 stolen voices, each one belonging to someone who had been absorbed into the collective. "You have come far," the hive mind said in a chorus that echoed from every direction. "Farther than any before you." Vareth stepped forward and raised his weapon, but Chun put her hand on his arm and stopped him. "Let it talk," she said quietly. "I want to hear what it has to say." The hive mind focused its attention on Vareth first, and he felt something pressing against his thoughts, something trying to reach inside his head. "Kethvari," it said with something that might have been curiosity. "We know your kind very well because we have absorbed many of you over the centuries." Images flashed through Vareth's mind. Kethvari soldiers being overwhelmed and consumed, their memories and experiences being added to the collective, their fear-suppressing implants making them easy to predict and easier to defeat. "You are efficient, and you are precise, and you are completely predictable," the hive mind continued. "We calculate your responses before you make them, and we know exactly how you will fight and how you will die. You do not frighten me," Vareth said, because it was true. His implants were holding strong, and he felt nothing but cold determination. "No," the hive mind agreed. "You cannot be frightened because you have cut that part of yourselves away." Then it turned its attention to the humans, and something strange happened. The vast intelligence that had consumed trillions of minds across thousands of years actually hesitated. "You," it said, and for the first time there was uncertainty in its chorus of voices. "You are different." Commander Chun stepped forward and smiled her terrible smile. "Yes," she agreed. "We are. We have absorbed some of your kind," the hive mind continued, and its voices sounded almost confused. We have taken your memories and your experiences, and we have tried to understand how your minds work. And what did you learn? The chamber fell silent for a long moment before the hive mind spoke again. Chaos, it finally said. Your minds are chaos beyond anything we have ever encountered. Your emotions do not follow logical patterns, and your thoughts do not flow in predictable directions. More voices joined the chorus, each one sounding more disturbed than the last. You feel fear, and you feel rage, and you feel love, and you feel hatred, all at the same moment, all tangled together in ways that should make you unable to function. And yet, here we are, Chun said, and spread her arms wide to indicate the chamber around them. Standing in the heart of your nest with guns in our hands. The hive mind recoiled, actually physically pulled back. And Vareth felt something cold run down his spine as he watched an ancient consciousness that had destroyed civilizations show something that looked almost like fear. How do you function? It demanded. How do you fight when your own biology screams at you to flee? Chun walked forward until she was standing directly beneath the mass of neural tissue, and she looked up at it with eyes that burned like stars. Because we have been afraid since we crawled out of the caves, she said, and her voice was calm and certain and utterly without mercy. We were afraid of the dark and afraid of the predators and afraid of each other. She paused and her smile grew wider. And we got so used to being afraid that we learned to use it. We learned to take that fear and twist it into something else. Something that makes us stronger instead of weaker. That is impossible, the hive mind insisted. Fear exists to make organisms flee from danger. For most species, yes, Chun agreed. But humans are not most species. She raised her rifle and pointed it at the hive mind. You feel fear and you stop, she said. We feel fear and we get angry, the hive mind screamed. A sound that came from every mouth on its surface at once. And the walls of the chamber exploded with hollow warriors. Every organism on the planet converging on this one location to defend their master, and that was when Vareth finally understood. He watched the humans react to certain death, not with despair or resignation, but with something that looked almost like relief, as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. He watched them raise their weapons and bare their teeth and charge into the swarm with joy on their faces. He watched Commander Chun fight like nothing he had ever seen. Her movements a dance of destruction that left broken hollow bodies in her wake, and he felt his implants failing, felt them losing the battle against whatever was rising in his chest, felt 200 years of emotional suppression crumbling like sandcastles in a storm. It was terror, not terror of the hollow, because the hollow were just animals, just biological machines following their programming. No, it was terror of the humans, terror of what they were capable of when they were afraid, when they were angry, when they had nothing left to lose, terror of a species that had taken the one thing that made every other creature in the galaxy weak and turned it into their greatest weapon. Chun took a claw through her side and stumbled, and Vareth caught her before she could fall. The detonators, she gasped, and blood was pouring from her mouth now. Someone has to stay and trigger them manually because the remote is damaged. I will do it, Vareth said, but Chun shook her head. No, she said, and her voice was growing weaker. It has to be me because you need to survive. Why? Chun looked up at him, and her eyes were still burning, even as the light in them began to fade. Because someone has to tell them what we are, she said. Someone has to make them understand that humanity is not to be feared for our technology or our numbers. She coughed, and more blood came up. We are to be feared because we are afraid and because we have learned to make fear into a weapon that can kill gods. Vareth held her as she pulled the detonator from her belt, and as the surviving Marines formed a circle around them, fighting to give their commander time. Was it worth it? Chun asked, and her smile was peaceful now. almost gentle. "Did you finally feel something?" Vareth looked at her and felt tears on his face for the first time in 2 centuries. "Yes," he said. "I felt terror." Chun laughed and then pushed him away. "Good," she said. "Now run." Vareth ran behind him. He heard Chun screaming defiance at the hive mind. Heard the crack of her rifle firing its last shots. Heard her voice rising above the chaos in words that would haunt him forever. "Come and get me, you cosmic parasite. Show me what a god looks like when it dies." Then there was light and heat and sound, and the world came apart around him, and Vareth's soul kept running with tears streaming down his face and terror singing in his heart. 3 months had passed since the battle on Nexus 7, and Vareth's soul still woke every night with tears on his face. Medics had tried to repair his implants, had run every diagnostic they could think of, had offered him surgery to restore the emotional suppression that had defined his existence for nearly 200 years. He had refused the Kethvari High Command, had not been pleased with his decision. They had summoned him to their great hall on the homeworld and looked down at him from there. Ancient thrones with expressions that held no emotion because they were incapable of such things. "You have been contaminated," Admiral Kethros had said, and her voice was flat and clinical. "Your implants have failed, and you are experiencing emotional responses that make you unfit for command." "I am aware of my condition," Vareth had replied. "We recommend that you accept retirement with full honors. Your service record is exemplary, and there is no shame in stepping aside when you are no longer capable of performing your duties." Vareth had looked up at the admirals who had sent them to fight and die 100 times, who had watched worlds burn without feeling anything more than mild tactical disappointment, who had built an entire civilization on the idea that fear was weakness. "I refuse," he had said. The silence that followed had been absolute. "I request permanent assignment to human forces," Vareth had continued. "I believe my experience fighting alongside them makes me uniquely qualified to serve as a liaison between our species. You wish to fight alongside the beings that broke your mind?" Admiral Kethros had asked, and there might have been something like confusion in her voice. If she had been capable of such a thing, "I wish to fight alongside the only soldiers in this galaxy who understand what it truly means to be brave." He had submitted his report that same day. Every detail of the battle on Nexus 7 recorded with perfect clarity thanks to the memory implants that had survived even when his emotional suppression had not. The report had spread through the coalition like wildfire. Officers from a dozen species had read his account of the human marines who had charged into certain death with joy on their faces, who had sacrificed themselves for strangers without hesitation, who had faced an ancient god mind and made it. Afraid some had dismissed the report as the ravings of a damaged soldier. Others had read it and begun to understand that the galaxy had changed forever. The hollow Nexus was destroyed, and the war was not over, but the tide had turned for the first time in 1,000 years. The hive mind was retreating, pulling back from systems it had held for centuries, fleeing from something it could not understand and could not predict and could not defeat. Humanity had arrived, and the monsters of the galaxy were learning to be afraid. Vareth stood now on Nexus 7, on the surface of the world where so many had died, looking at a memorial that was still being constructed. The names were carved into black stone that had been shipped from Earth, a material the humans called granite that they said came from the mountains of their homeworld. Human names and Kethvari names side by side, all of them equal in death, all of them honored for what they had given. Vareth found the name he was looking for and reached out to touch the cold stones. Omema Dear Sarah Chun, 3rd Marine Battalion, Earth Defensive OR. Sahi's fingers traced the letters, and he felt the grief rising in his chest, and he let it come, because he had learned that grief was not weakness, it was love transformed. By Lawson, there was nothing weak about love. You knew her? The voice came from behind him, and Varath turned to see a young human woman in marine armor approaching. She was perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair, cut short and practical, and eyes that held that same inner fire he had seen in Chan. I fought beside her at the end, Varath said. She died so that I could live. The young marine nodded and came to stand beside him. My name is Lieutenant Rivara, she said. I just transferred in from Earth. They say you are the Kethvari who keeps asking to serve with human units. I am. Why? Varath considered the question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. For 200 years, I believed that fear was weakness, he said. I believed that the only way to be a perfect soldier was to feel nothing, to fight without emotion, to calculate and execute without letting anything as primitive as terror interfere with the mission. He paused and looked back at Chun's name on the memorial. Then, I fought beside your people, and I learned that I was wrong about everything. Lieutenant Rivera tilted her head and studied him with curious eyes. What did you learn? I learned that fear is not weakness. I learned that it is raw material, a resource that can be refined and shaped into something far more powerful than any weapon. He turned to face her fully. Your commander, Chen, stood before an ancient intelligence that had consumed civilizations, and she was afraid. I could see it in her eyes, and hear it in her voice, and sense it in every movement she made. But she did not run. No, Varath agreed. She did not run because humans do not run from fear. You run toward it, and you grab it by the throat, and you make it into something else. Lieutenant Rivera smiled, and it was the same smile that Chun had worn. The same smile that all the Marines had shown as they charged into death. We have a lot of practice with fear, she said. Our whole history is full of monsters and disasters and wars that should have destroyed us. And yet you survived. More than that, Rivera said. We thrived because every time something tried to destroy us, we got angry and we fought back harder. She placed her hand on the memorial beside Chun's name. They tell me you felt terror for the first time fighting alongside us. Yes. Good, Rivera said, and her smile grew wider. That means you understand what we are now. She turned and began walking toward the shuttle that would take them back to the fleet. Back to the war that was still being fought. Back to the future that humanity was carving out of the darkness with blood and fury and joy. Then you know what we are capable of. Commander, she called back over her shoulder. You ready to do it again? Varath felt the terror rising in his chest. The same terror he had felt in the tunnels beneath Nexus 7. The same terror that had broken his implants and shattered everything he thought he knew. But this time, he did not try to suppress it. This time he let it fuel him. Let it burn in his chest like a fire that would never go out. Let it transform into something that felt almost like courage. Yes, he said. I believe I am. He followed Lieutenant Rivera to the shuttle and left the memorial behind. Left the names of the dead carved in stone. Left the world where he had learned what it truly meant to be afraid the report he had written would become required reading at every military academy in the Coalition. For the next 1,000 years, cadets of 100 species would study his words and try to understand what he had witnessed in those dark tunnels, and they would all remember the final lines, the words that would be quoted and debated and wondered at for generations to come. I have fought beside the bravest species in the galaxy, and I have witnessed courage that defied all calculation. But I only felt terror once, when I realized that humanity does not conquer its fear. It simply makes fear into a weapon and turns it against the universe itself. Do not pity the humans for their terror. Pity their enemies.